Hello and welcome to another episode of Texas Tracks and Taps. I am John.
I'm Graham.
And I'm Coy.
And today we have one of the heaviest topics that we have ever talked about. We are going to cover protest and advocacy songs. And because it's a heavy subject, we're going to need something to wet our lips and our whistles so that we can make it through this episode. So, guys, what are we going to be drinking tonight?
Well, tonight we've got St. Arnold Brewing in our glasses. I went with an Irish Hello. It's the dry Irish stout. Friendly and roasty, as it says on the can, easy drinking, dry stout. It's very tasty. It is very light and palatable. I like it. But yeah, St. Arnold's has been around since 1994. It is the oldest Texas craft brewery. Still independently owned, family owned and operated, which is very cool. And sold out to big beer like some of the other ones that have been around a bit longer. So yeah, it's down in Houston. I unfortunately have not had a chance to make it down there to the brewery yet, but you guys have both visited. John, you very recently. So what did y'all think of the brewery down there?
Yeah, it's been, I think, almost a year since I went there, but coming back from a trip to Galveston, I stopped in there and checked it out because they've been one of the breweries that I've liked for a long time here in Texas. I've had their stuff for pretty much since I've been into craft beer. So I went to stop in there, and I love the way they've done it with the stained glass and, St. Arnold being the patron saint of brewers. And yet to Graham's point, in 1994 is when they opened up. And not only are they from Houston, but they opened it in Houston because it was one of the largest cities in the country that didn't have a microbrewery. So that helped them even more decide, yeah, we need to do this in Houston. So very cool place. I was going to get their Art Car IPA. That's usually one of my go-tos that I can easily find for them, but didn't have a chance to grab it. But if you've been to the brewery, you've seen the Art Car. It's pretty cool. Painted up car. But since I didn't have a chance to go to the store and get that, I was like, I wonder if I have anything in my cellar, which is slang for a fridge in my garage. And I did find this, and this is the 25th anniversary Grand Cru. I was saving it for a special occasion to share it. Or actually, I just kind of forgot that I had it. So it was from 2019. If you do the math, if they opened in 94, their 25th anniversary would have been 2019. So I've been cellaring it or garage fridging it for almost 5 years now. And I guess over 5 years. So this is it's a blend of three different bourbon barrel aged beers. There's a Belgian quad in here, Russian Imperial Stout, and English style barley wine. So it is thick and heavy, like some of the topics we're going to talk about today. So I think you guys went with lighter fare, but I said, no, this is heavy, man. I gotta have a 10 point, whatever, 11 or 11.1% beer for this heavy conversation. No, just kidding. It was just really the only one. I had a couple others, but I was like, I'm probably going to save those. I had a couple Bishop's barrels, which if those are like their really select barrel aged stuff that they do. So, but yeah, that's what I reached for. But what are you drinking, John? And what was your experience like at the brewery just recently?
Yeah, as I talk, I'm interested in a real time taste to see how you like yours, since that's kind of a rare one. But I did visit recently, but I decided to try the lemon and grapefruit citrus shandy, which this is really the wrong time of the year to be drinking it. We're, in the winter months right now, even though I think it's going to be pretty warm the next few days here in Texas.
I think we hit 80.
Yeah. I might have gotten sunburnt today.
It's definitely hot down here
in February, on February 2nd, ground or 3rd, whatever day it is.
But it's delicious. I mean, when I cracked it open and tried it, I was like, man, this is like amazing. This is going to be a definite summer go-to for me. Very refreshing beer. And when I was down there, I actually had a couple I tried an ale, and I don't remember what the other one was that I tried when I was there, but I just remembered now I'm 3 for 3. Like, I enjoyed all three beers that I've tried from St. Arnold. So great brewery. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I picked up a St. Arnold glass, which I'm really proud to be able to finally say that I've got a pint glass that says Texas on it. So proud of my glass. But Coy, have you had a chance to take a sip of yours and tell us how it tastes?
I have. I let it sit for a little bit before I had it. It is bold, rich, boozy. It has actually aged really well. Still has a lot of carbonation. As soon as I opened the bottle and poured it, I was like, oh, this is going to be good because it hasn't gone flat. I think it probably did condition in the bottle pretty well from what I can tell. I didn't have this fresh when it came out. I wish I could have had it then and be able to compare it to now, but getting some oakiness and wood from the barrels as well, which is really nice. So I wish I could be sharing this with you guys in person. I feel very greedy just drinking this by myself.
All right. Enjoy
it.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. So, the past few weeks, I've been talking to a lot of people, and I think that there's a lot of folks that have been worried, concerned, just kind of riled up in general about what's going on in the world and in the U.S. And one of the things that I want to make extremely clear is that on Texas Tracks and Taps, we don't get political around here, and we don't talk blue and red unless you're mentioning Blue Moon and Red Stripe. So we're actually you like that quote, didn't you?
I didn't know where you're going, and it was amazing. Thank you.
We don't get political, but we definitely talk about music. And one of the great, I think, sub-genres of music out there, throughout all of history has been protest music, advocacy music. It's really a great forum to be able to make a change and express yourself in terms of what your ideas are. And it's always been that way since way back in history. And, we were chatting before we actually started the recording today just to, talk about the history of political songs. And I learned by reading a Harvard political article online that Yankee Doodle Dandy was actually a political song in the, way back, I want to say well over 200 years ago. So, or now I guess it would be close to 300 years ago. So, political songs have been around for pretty much all of time. And we are very familiar with the 60s and the 70s and a lot of the 80s of all the political songs that came out. But, one of the things I wanted to just have an open discussion with the two of you is, what has that political music meant to the two of you through the years? And, do you feel like the artists of today are continuing that mantra and are still kind of pushing the envelope, or at least sharing their thoughts and advocacy and thoughts in lyrics and songs? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And, just kind of want to open up to you guys. What are your thoughts initially?
I'll say this, that I think one thing that as I was going through a lot of songs that have been rallying cries for protesting or activism, that I think a lot of these songs don't get written with the mindset of like, I'm going to write a protest song. They're written out of like, artists are very empathetic people. I think to be any kind of artist, you just are really high on empathy. And when they see something and they get outraged by it and they identify it, and their medium is to create art with it. And then you create this song and it resonates with everybody else, and then it gets picked up. So I think that happens a lot more than like, I'm going to set out to write a protest song, although I think that happens too. But that was kind of the original kind of trend that I just saw, is I think people are just writing about how things make them feel. And whether it's a love song or a song, all of these things, like anti-war is as a love song. It's about wanting to see love conquer racism or war or all these things that we know are inherently bad. And so that was the other thing, is I think you can run a common thread through a lot of this. It's like, yeah, I'm mad. Yeah, I'm angry, but you're only those feelings because things can be better. And so I think we're all, proud to be from this country, although it's not a perfect country. And I think this stuff comes from wanting to live up to the potential of what America can be, and when we fall short. But I've got songs that aren't just about America, that are, other countries definitely aren't perfect either. And you get protest songs in, like the UK, Ireland, South Africa, Australia, all over. But that was kind of just my initial thoughts on it, was like, yeah, I think a lot of times it's just writing the truth, and the truth connecting with a lot of people, which we've talked about before with, whatever the theme is, as long as it's truth and there's beauty in that truth, or some type of connection to the human element, it just picks up and spreads, and becomes a much bigger thing than just the song itself. Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Coy. I totally agree with your sentiments on all that you just said, but I think for protest music, what it means to me is, when artists, like you said, they get passionate about these things, that to me inspires me to want to kind of explore these issues that they're talking about. And there's a lot of times where, I might be aware of the issue, from one lens or through one perspective, but to see it through a different perspective through somebody's song that can help you, kind of come to a different understanding of an issue. And that's to me why they're so powerful, is when those artists get so passionate about it, and you can see that passion in their performance of the song or just in the lyrics themselves as they write those songs, it can have such an impact. And I think, John, you posed the question, is that something that's still alive and active and happening today? And I feel like it probably is, maybe to a lesser extent, but I feel like it's harder for those songs to kind of make it into the mainstream, music media, music consciousness, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I think every now and then some of those do flip through and rile a bunch of feathers, but maybe not as much as it should be. I feel like there's probably, some voices out there that need to be heard that aren't being heard. And it's unfortunate, but I don't really know, what the answer to that is necessarily. But I think there is still that kind of music being made for sure. And I have some examples because I'm going to go through some songs that, kind of through history, that have been instrumental protest songs, activist songs. But there were some, kind of in more recent years that I thought were really interesting that aren't as well known. Like I said, I just don't think they get the light of day as much as kind of they did back in the 60s or 70s, when everything was just very, I guess, things were very outspoken then. And now it seems like, that everyone's just trying not to offend everyone else. And, you kind of just keep your opinions to yourself because you don't want to get in an argument or have a heated debate with anyone. And everyone just tiptoes around issues a lot, it seems. And
Graham's not on social media, you can tell. Because that is not happening on social media. That was my thought, was that I think back, in earlier times, we didn't have social media. So this was more of a way for people to rally around something. But now,
well, that's true.
you have these keyboard, warriors who are whatever side of the debate they're on. They're so much more emboldened by social media and being able to just do it safely behind a computer, and then finding other people that are like-minded was much easier than it ever was. And so I think that's overshadowed what, music's ability to do it. It's like getting lost in that shuffle, because there definitely is still some modern stuff happening, but no one's listening to music for that anymore.
Yeah.
Like they almost want music to escape from it, I think, more than. But also, cancel culture is an important thing too, where you're afraid to like lose part of their fan base. That's their livelihood and what makes them money. So of course you want to be careful with that. But I mean, part of what I was going to say is that cancel culture isn't new. It's just kind of flipped around to who's getting canceled now versus who was being what I'll call soft censored back in the day. If you came out with something, the labels and the radio stations would just not play your music. That was how so it wasn't like they canceled you, but they just tried to censor you by not playing your stuff in hopes that it wouldn't find its way out into the public, but it would. So, I mean, the thing I've found by like kind of looking into all the decades of this type of music is that things haven't changed that much, even going back to like the 30s and 40s, and there's still music about the same stuff. And it's been almost 100 years, and there's been great progress, but there hasn't been enough, is what it feels like.
You both brought up like two great points that I kind of just jotted down. But Graham, you mentioned awareness. So, I remember, back in the 1980s, there was a song about Sun City, and there was like a whole collective of artists that came together that said, hey, we're not going to play Sun City. I didn't know what Sun City was. I didn't know what apartheid was. And a song like that, brings awareness, like it educates people. So, I had no idea up until that point what was going on in South Africa. And so, and that ties into the next point that I kind of took notes on, which I think we could probably do another episode on, is how people are consuming their music today. And I really hate using that term consume, but I think it's, for lack of a argument of a better word, I think that, things were different. Like you said, Coy, back, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have social media. You're dead on about how radio stations wouldn't play your music, or they would put warning labels on your records, right? That's where that all came from, which that was actually Al Gore's wife, wasn't it? That started that. So I forget her name. What was it?
Tipper Gore.
Tipper Gore, that's right. Yeah, she was the one that put labels on all of our music, like in the 1980s, warning us of, bad lyrics or subject matter. So yeah, I mean, you both hit the nail on the head there. Like, there's protest songs or advocacy or awareness songs. They educate the masses. I want to go back to the point that Coy actually was talking about earlier, which is about musicians and how they write songs, and they come from an area of empathy. So, Coy, I know you're a musician. Graham, you've got musicians in your bloodline that you're related to. Any personal experiences with that? Like, when it comes to, protest songs or anything, advocacy, I guess? Coy's giggling.
I'd be glad just to write a song, much less a protest song. I've maybe completed 3 whole songs in my life, so I think you'd give me a lot of credit for my songwriting ability. I mean, I've always been drawn to those songs, but I think for me, it goes back to the awareness that Graham's and you have talked about previously, is that more than anything, it just made me aware that there is much different experiences than my own experiences. I do feel like also musicians or artists, like, mostly write what they know. And so for some of them to have the level of empathy to be like, this isn't something I personally know or have experienced, but I see it and I won't stand for it, and so I've always admired that. And I got into U2 when I was a teenager, and like you talked about apartheid, they had a song Silver and Gold off of Rattle and Hum that was a song about that. And then Bono was a part of that Sun City album or track. And that's kind of everyone remembers We Are the World, like, pop and everybody came together to sing that, or Do They Know It's Christmas? Those were good awareness songs, good activism songs, but they were very feel good, and which is good. You need that too. You can't all be like, doom and gloom. There's uniting through, spreading love and positivity, which those songs did. They brought awareness to injustice, and this is how we're going to do it. We're going to come together and we're going to fix it as one, human race and not a bunch of individual races. But yeah, Sun City's different. Sun City was like, a lot of people don't know about this, and we're going to come at it a little bit more aggressive. And it's I would say almost like a dance track, and it had like hip hop, and a lot of UK influence. It's a really, really cool song. But yeah, that kind of then kicked on a lot of the apartheid stuff and the free Nelson Mandela movement in the 80s. But what I learned kind of digging into this, there's actually a song, I hadn't heard it before, but it's Peter Gabriel wrote a song in 1980 about a prisoner that died in South Africa. And he was an activist, peaceful, protester that was wrongly imprisoned and died. And I think it's Biko is the name of that song. And that's really the song that then got like U2 and everyone else in the 80s, like really aware of apartheid. So artists even influence other artists, when they write stuff that's just about, this is something going on in the world that's not right. So I thought that
great
was
song, by the way.
That is
great
a really great song. Yeah. So it was really cool to learn that, like, what I thought was the songs that were teaching me about apartheid, there was actually songs even before that were teaching the artists that were teaching me. So it's like, yeah, that was a big part of the 80s that got kind of overshadowed by the We Are the World and the Do They Know It's Christmas, which were also very good movements. But yeah.
So Sun City wasn't my first, I think, discovery of like political type songs, but it certainly is one that resonates with me and it kind of popped into my head. But what were your first, I guess the first kind of songs that you realized were really political songs back in your childhood?
Yeah, in my childhood, I think it was probably We Are the World was the first one that really sticks with me, even though it's like I said, it's not necessarily a protest, that it's just a awareness activism type song. But I mean, like that, I have some of my first memories of music are just seeing like, yeah, the risers filled with all those famous musicians coming together to sing about this. And then of course, Live Aid was another kind of like, I feel like just a cultural moment for that. But I'll tell you what, there's more songs that I remember from childhood that I didn't realize were political until I was older. And the one
I'm glad you bring that up. That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, because I mean, as a kid, you are not, and you shouldn't be worried about this stuff. So it really wasn't until I got into my teens that I really started to like get more connected to songs that were about, political or just worldly events. But yeah, as a kid, I would say Born in the USA, you heard it all the time. I mean, it was a huge song, great song. I thought it was a very patriotic song, and it is, because I think Bruce Springsteen even says you can be both proud of your country and want it to change and be better. They're not mutually exclusive things. But you heard that everywhere, and you heard it as a patriotic song. And I think Ronald Reagan used it for both of his campaigns, or at least one of his campaigns when he was running for president against Bruce's, wishes. And I think Trump did the same thing to him. Mm-hmm. But it's like, yeah, the people weren't really getting what that song was about, even grown adults, much less, me who was a child. But when I got older, I'm like, oh, this is a song about an America that has turned its back on a veteran of the Vietnam War. He fought for a country that came back and didn't, wasn't there for him. So yeah, there's just so many layers usually to these types of songs. That's really what I think makes them so good and such a draw and so interesting to talk about and to listen to, but also what makes it resonate for people to want to use as their presidential campaign song, with even if they don't realize what, maybe it's not the best choice, but
then they get to
yeah. Yeah, Graham, what were you going to say about the songs from childhood?
No, just, to piggyback on what you were saying, the first protest song that I ever heard or remember hearing in my childhood is one that I didn't realize was a protest song, like you were saying, and that I think a lot of people maybe even still don't realize it's a protest song, and that is "This Land Is Your Land" by Woody Guthrie in 1940. Going back a little further, but yeah, it becomes clear if you actually pay attention, to some of the lines in there. I mean, he says, one point, there was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, it said private property, but on the backside, it didn't say nothing. And this land was made for you and me. And one bright sunny morning in the shadow of the steeple by the relief office, I saw my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there wondering if God blessed America for me. So it's very clearly, got some pointed, points in there that are definitely, signs of protest. But, but everybody thinks of it as kind of like the Born in the USA thing. They think of it as this patriotic song, and it's really not what that was about. I mean, it was kind of is this actually the America that founders set out to make, or have we twisted it into something that's, restricting freedom, Yeah. So to me, it was very interesting to learn. And I mean, I learned that some years ago, but yeah, I mean, it's Woody Guthrie is great, and he's got a lot of really good songs of that ilk. If you dive into his stuff at all. Go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say I had an epiphany too as a kid, growing up with, I guess, my parents' generation went through Vietnam and heard all these songs on the radio. And one of the songs that I heard dozens and dozens of times was CCR's Fortunate Son.
Yep.
And, as a kid, you're thinking it's just about a kid that's fortunate, right? Like you're not interpreting the lyrics. But as I became a teenager and learned that, it's actually about people that skipped out on Vietnam War and got out of the draft. And he's singing about how he's not one of those people. So it was kind of eye-opening to me. And, I think it was
sorry, I was going to say, I think it was Dwight Eisenhower's grandson.
who it's about.
Specifically that one of those fortunate sons, because he was prime age for draft and did not get drafted because he was born to a different set of parents than all the other guys. Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, like, I didn't live through that experience, but it completely changes, as a young person, kind of learning more about music and understanding how songs are written and why they're written. It was really eye-opening to me. I remember that one I just completely misinterpreted it. And I would agree, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA was another one that you think is, just a big poppy song that's happy-go-lucky to be celebrating being born in the USA, but there's a story behind it, right? So that was another one that I do remember, when I learned about what it was really about, I was like, wow, it's kind of a gut punch what Bruce really meant. But, I guess let's dive.
Before we change gears, sorry, I just want to say, Graham, I'm glad you brought up Woody Guthrie, because I know we're also going to talk about Bob Dylan, and that's kind of a connected conversation. But it's when you talk about these types of songs, you think about Bob Dylan for sure, but Woody Guthrie is a huge influence on Bob Dylan. And Woody Guthrie would play shows on his guitar, it would say, "This machine kills fascists," and which is very much, he wrote a song for World War II that was all you fascists bound to lose, which is also a really cool song. But that song was obviously, about America fighting Nazi Germany. But after the war, that became a song that the civil rights movement adopted. And a lot of the folk, singers were really a big part of that movement. But in fun fact, Wilco covers that song, and it's a pretty cool cover if you want to check that out, Grant.
Wilco and Big Bragg.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then, John, I'm glad you brought up CCR, Unfortunate Son, because, that era, there was so much good music. For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, I think, is another really good one from that era. Well, you had civil rights going on, you had Vietnam going on, and all this stuff. But what another good era that I found in the research was also the 9/11 era, and just the reaction of all the events that happened after 9/11. Of course, there was 9/11 itself, but one of the things I was reading was basically talking about how George W. Bush was one of the most fortunate sons ever. And you had all these protest songs coming out of that era too. So that whole fortunate son mentality, or not mentality, but concept that inspired protest music in that era, was still still resonating with the songs that came out from Green Day and so many bands that were, and artists. And we talk about the Chicks getting in trouble with their fan base over, not being fans of George W. Bush. But yeah, I mean, I'll give both sides of the coin their due. Country music writes a lot of patriotic pro-America stuff, and that's good. I think that's important too. And then rock, I think, tends to be a little bit more cynical and wants to point out that not everything is always great. We can be, again, like Springsteen said, we can be proud of our country and still want better. But yeah, what else were you going to say before?
No, I was going to delve into kind of the 60s, because there's been a resurgence. You mentioned Bob Dylan, obviously with the movie that's come out, there's really been a resurgence in interest in, knowing and learning more about Bob Dylan's catalog of music, as well as Pete Seeger, because I think Pete Seeger has a big part in that movie as well. I haven't seen it yet, which one of these days, maybe as a group, we need to go see that.
Yeah.
But, Bob Dylan, since he's very relevant these days with the movie that's come out, Timothy Chalamet plays Bob Dylan. If you're not familiar with the movie that I'm referencing, he had a significant impact on kind of political songs in the 1960s. So when you guys were doing your research and kind of delving into this, were there any Dylan songs that kind of resonated or kind of stood out to you?
Oh, definitely. I mean, well, and to just hit on Pete Seeger real quick, because one of the songs that, I have in my notes is Turn, 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 to Everything There's a Season, which the Byrds have made popular, but their version. But that was a song written by Pete Seeger, which most of the song, actually, 95% of the lyric comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, just talking about how there's a time for everything, a season for everything. There's actually only 2 lines in the song that aren't from the Bible, and that's the turn part, and then a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. So that, was something that Pete, those were Pete's words. And so that was a plea from him to, for peace, an anti-war, rallying cry. So, but yeah, obviously Pete was, huge influence on Bob. And then with Bob, you've got Blowing in the Wind, which was performed by Peter, Paul, and Mary, as well as Dylan himself. But Peter, Paul, and Mary actually performed it from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the March on Washington in 1963. So it was a pretty monumentous moment for a protest song, as it were. And the times they are changing, obviously it was a huge anthem for, just the broad societal changes that were happening at that time, so, yeah, Bob Dylan, obviously, you could go on and on forever, but, Coy, what were some of the Bob Dylan highlights for you?
Yeah, you named both of the ones that first come to mind for me. And just to piggyback on what you're saying, I'm Blowing in the Wind. He wrote that in 63, if I'm not mistaken. So that's how, of the moment and of the time it was, that the year he wrote it would be the same year that, that it could be performed on the steps
Right.
during that march. And just talk about an artist that resonated so much with what was going on and with the people. But some other ones, some deeper maybe cuts. There is Masters of War that Dylan wrote in 63 also. And very, like, he even says, like, he can protest and not wish that anybody, like, any harm come to people. It's like, we can disagree and I can believe this and I'm not going to really wish you ill will. But when it came to this subject of just the sometimes the war machine that America can be, he doesn't really hold back as much as he does. And he's just like, yeah, I'll tell you exactly how I feel about you if you're gonna, make money or your life on the suffering of other people. And then a little bit later in the 70s, The Hurricane is another one that I think is a really good, it could be just like a folk song about a folk, character, but it's a real story. It's a true story. And he drew so much of his inspiration from true stories and things that just needed awareness. And then that became a movie with Denzel Washington. So if you don't know, like, it's the boxer. He was set up for a murder that he didn't commit. And of course, a person of color and all the injustice that goes with that as well. So those are kind of the main ones. But we could, again, do a whole episode on Bob Dylan and
yeah, absolutely.
Masters
of War is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And it's, no secret because of the poster that hangs on the wall behind me. I'm a Pearl Jam fan. They occasionally do a cover of that. That's amazing. But I was looking back that the Roots actually did a cover.
Oh, cool.
Of that song. And it was like a 14-minute version of it several years ago. I think they did it for Bob Dylan. And it's a really great song. And we could do an episode, I think, on 1960s protest songs alone. We could probably talk for hours about that because there's just probably hundreds of them. John Lennon, who we haven't even mentioned yet, but I got a lot of notes on him heading into the 70s. But
before we move on, I kind of want to go back just a step before we move on, down the chronologically to where we're headed. But a song that Pete Seeger actually did a cover of is "Which Side Are You On" by Florence Reese. The lyrics were written in response to violence that broke out between coal miners and their bosses. When the coal miners, they formed a union and they went on strike and their wages decreased. But this was known as the Harlan County War, or the Bloody Harlan. The melody is actually centuries old, but Florence Reese wrote the actual lyrics, and Jim Garland also covered it, and Pete Seeger covered that song. So I think that was probably one of the first, maybe not the first, but one of the earliest, like, American protest songs officially, maybe, I could be wrong on that. But and then, I think maybe even Coy, you might have been talking about this song earlier, "Strange Fruit." Billie Holiday, Abel Meeropol and Billie Holiday but it was a condemnation of the American lynching of blacks, in the South. And
that's from 1939. So we're almost 100 years removed from that song, but that's how long. Because there's songs now about, the same topic, not necessarily lynching, but just, Black Lives Matter and, civil rights are still important today as they were back then. And so and I said it before, huge steps have been made, mostly because of the civil rights movement and that we've been talking about. Like that made huge steps in the right direction, but to say that it's like a thing of the past, like I don't, it's like there's still, when we get caught up to present day, we're still going to find songs like Strange Fruit. In fact, I think Kanye West sampled some of that for one of his songs, Blood on the Leaves, because that is a line from that song. But that's one of the darkest, most harrowing songs that I've listened to, actually. And I just recently discovered it when we were researching for this episode. And I won't even get into a lot of it because it's just so dark. But if you're wondering, it's strange fruit that grows on trees in the South, to what Graham is saying. So that's where it gets its theme from. And Billy just heard about that happening in the South and she said like that just came out of her. Like the song had never like been produced so quickly and so like forcefully from her than the song that came out when she heard that. So great song of awareness and bringing light to something in the 30s that would take another 30 years before it really got, marched.
Pretty ballsy for the 1930s to
and here's
a song like that.
So controversial at the time. In fact, controversial at the time that many of the record labels refused to even record it. Yeah, she took it to a friend of hers named Milt Gabler and sang it a cappella for him. And he was so moved to tears by it, that he agreed to record it and distribute the song. So that's how that actually came about. Like I said, very, very dark, very sad, very disturbing. But it's those kind of things, those kind of songs that can have an impact and open up people's eyes to, the different kinds of atrocities and things that are, terrible things that should never ever happen. So I think it's important that, people made this music and that people still make music that, sends a message. So, but anyway, go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny when I started diving in and doing a little bit of research on a lot of there's all kinds of lists out there in terms of top protest songs, which I don't know if I necessarily think that there's a difference between number 1 and number 50. I mean, they probably all are valid in terms of what they're writing about and trying to, debate or argue. But Sam Cooke, Change Is Gonna Come, is at the top of most lists that I saw that are out there. And so, it was interesting. And Coy, you've said this like, I think 2 or 3 times already. We're still working through all of the same issues here almost 100 years later, when we're talking about some of the songs that were written, 50, 60 years later, we're still talking about the same issues. And it's pathetic, but, probably 50 or 60 years from now, I would anticipate we'll probably still be saying about the same issues. It's sad to say, but that's just the way the world works. But as we head into, I guess maybe, just kind of breaking this out by decade into the 1970s, are there any call outs, anything that really stood out to you in terms of songs that impacted you?
War Pigs by Black Sabbath. I'll go ahead and throw that one out there because I think that was right on 1970. But you can feel some connection to Dylan's Masters of War that was written 7 years previous to that. But obviously, Black Sabbath kind of pioneers in that genre of, the harder rock, the metal that we would get in the 80s and things like that. But I've always really liked that song. But if you really listen to the words, it's definitely about, not being a big fan of the people that profit off of war.
Yeah. And it's a classic Black Sabbath song, obviously.
Yeah. Such a cool song in its own right. And it's just a cool riff. But one I thought of from the 70s, well, a couple, 1970 exactly, War by Edwin Starr, which was written by the Temptations, actually recorded it, but it wasn't actually a hit for them. Many people wanted them to release it as a single, but then the band themselves, the Temptations, were apprehensive of the controversy that it might cause. And so Edwin Starr ended up recording it, and it was a smash hit, and propelled him to stardom. So, but pretty obvious what the statement of that song is. I don't really have to get into that. But interestingly, during the pro-war frenzy of post 9/11, like you were talking about, Quay, the song was listed as lyrically questionable by Clear Channel Communications.
The song War?
Yeah.
What is it good for?
Yeah.
So they could, Clear Channel could think of at least one thing. War's good for. So I'm glad you brought that one up. That was on my list too, because the Temptations originally wrote it and recorded it, and then Edwin Starr took it and made it famous. But a lot of the 70s is going to be anti-war because coming out of Vietnam. But the Temptations did Ball of Confusion. Have you ever heard that song? It's basically this world, just a big ball of confusion. And to bring it to Texas, Leon Bridges covered it, and it's awesome. Like both versions are phenomenal, but I love Leon Bridges. We love Leon Bridges. Check out his cover of Ball of Confusion. But it's just basically like just trying to make sense of the world in the late 60s, really all of the 60s and a lot of the 70s. So that it's just really, I think they did finally, even though they didn't do it with their version of War, they did get it out with that song Ball of Confusion, which when you think of the Temptations, you don't necessarily think of either, war or any kind of protest song, but they had a lot to say. I mean, like everybody, again, I think it comes down to when you tap into music, you're tapping into something that on an empathetic and on a human level that is, it's just, you will by accident or on purpose write things that are viewed as an activism or protest song, I think. But
yeah. And then 1971, one of my favorite artists of all time, Johnny Cash, released Man in Black, which was basically just calling out the treatment of the poor and the mass incarcerations in the wake of, Vietnam and all that. So huge song, huge song for me, huge song for him. Kind of, obviously he was huge at the time and it was very impactful. So that's all I've really got for the 70s.
Two of my favorites.
I had, going back even to the 60s with Johnny Cash, I'm glad you mentioned him. He came out with a whole album about the treatment of Native Americans in 1964. I think that album's called Bitter Tears. But he had one of the songs on there is Ballad of Ira Hayes. And just he's part Cherokee, I believe. So he just really identified that. So part of that civil rights movement of the 60s he was wanting to write these songs about that. And that got him soft censored, as we would call it today, cancel culture. But I mean, like his, when you think about it, probably his fan base. But at the same time, he was very involved with Bob Dylan and all of those folk singers. So, but I thought that was interesting because I listened to that song and I didn't realize he had a whole album of that. And so he was definitely already doing that in the 60s, but 70s, he continued to do it. And I think even we talked about Chris Christopherson. When we get to the 80s, I have some stuff that he wasn't shy to be political at all and to use his platform to talk about the people that that didn't have a voice. He was very, very, and I think that's what about a lot of these artists are. It's like we have the platform to speak for underrepresented people, and we see that through every decade we talk about.
Yeah, I think we should probably, the 80s is where I think we're all going to start coming of age ourselves here. But two of my, before we leave the 70s, two of my, I think the most impactful songs that I kind of jot down to me personally come from the 1970s. And one of them I don't think is really necessarily a protest song. It's really a song that was written to pull people together and to unite them. And I think it's, I was reading up on the song. It's been misinterpreted through the years, but John Lennon's Imagine, whenever I hear that song, it like brings my heart rate down, 10 paces. It calms me. It's just such a beautiful song to me. And I don't know if it's really a protest song. But the other one, when I actually got back into vinyl collecting many, 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 many years ago, it was either my second or third album that I repurchased. It was Marvin Gaye's What's Going On.
Mhm.
And the song by itself is just beautiful. And I think it's very meaningful if you actually read through the lyrics in terms of what's going on in the 1970s when Marvin Gaye wrote it. But the entire album is actually beautiful if you haven't heard that album. But a rarity.
Sorry, before we move on, I just want to
Yeah.
say that was on my list too, and I not only listened to his version, but it made me want to re-listen to all the artists that came together after September 11th and re-recorded it. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like Bono and Gwen Stefani and Eve and Lil Kim, and a lot of rap and rock and pop came together for that. And man, with Fred Durst coming in and having the final rap verse. Yeah, I was just like, man, this just doesn't hold up quite as well as the Marvin Gaye version.
Nothing says protest like Limp Bizkit.
Oh man, but they had good intentions, but sometimes they should have just probably played the original versus recording that one. But I think it made a lot of money now, like for charity. So
rarity from the 70s was God Save the Queen. That actually came out in 1977.
I've got that on my list.
It wasn't a U.S. protest song, but it was obviously a British one. So
yeah, I mentioned earlier that there's not just protest songs in America, and that was one of the ones I was thinking of because especially punk had a lot of that. The Clash, Guns of Brixton from 1979, from London Calling, which was one of my favorite albums of all time, is about police brutality in London against, that's not as so much a racial thing. So like the police brutality conversation it's gone on for decades too, and is not always just racial in nature, depending on where you're from. One other one that's early 70s, I think it's 1970. So it's a little bit more from probably the 60s, just carryover from the 60s, but it's Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young about the Kent State, again, on the topic of police or military brutality on its civilians. That was a huge event. And really a lot of the Nixon era, I feel like, is a lot like the George W. Bush era. You get a lot of this type of music, depending on who the president is. So we might be in store for another wave of this. Kind of what I was left thinking, because between Nixon and George W. Bush, you got a lot of music like this that came out or was re-recorded. The originals got re-recorded by modern artists. So we'll see what happens in the next couple years. But yeah, I think that's Get Up, Stand Up by the Wailers. It was also from the 70s, and that's a huge protest song. Most originally written about poverty in Kingston, where Bob Marley grew up, but also he actually, after he visited Asia and saw the poverty there, is what actually inspired him to write it. But he probably drew on a lot of his own experience doing it as well. I watched the Fire Aid concert for the fires in LA, and Joni Mitchell's performance was really, really moving for me. She did Both Sides Now, which is a great song about being like the way we view things when we're young versus when we grow up. But I think that's not a protest song, but it's just I think it is a good perspective song, and that you can use it for trying to see, everything within reason. But the actual song of hers that I wanted to mention was Big Yellow Taxi, because I know that's been covered by Counting Crows. It might come up later in our decades, but she wrote it originally. And we haven't touched on environmental activism yet. And that might be the only song I have for environmental activism. But she wrote that in Hawaii after looking at her hotel and seeing all the parking lots that had paved over the paradise, essentially. So I did want to give a shout out to Joni Mitchell before we leave the 70s, because I think she wrote that in 1970.
When it was Counting Crows and
Vanessa Carlton.
Oh, Vanessa Carlton.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
She had the bop bop.
Yeah. Which is great if you think about it. Like Joni Mitchell has I think it's Shabop Bop or something. It's a very like poppy little scat phrase, but she puts it in right after like a pretty like sobering sentence, and it's just like Shababa, it's like we're just supposed to like kind of pop our way through this, what's going on, so very interesting use of a throwaway lyric there.